Hello everyone, we're going to start this lecture on Introduction to Environmental Issues and Sustainability in Engineering with the history of environmental issues. And what we want for you is to appreciate the historical context of environmental engineering. And we're going to give you examples, and these examples will help you to link these issues with science and policy. And we want you to gain understanding about human impacts on the earth, and later on not only at local level but now later on at planetary level. So we're going to start first reviewing history, and then we're going to move to present times. So let's start discussing what were the environmental issues that were facing different humans throughout the early years. So, and we're going to divide this by explaining what happened to solid waste management, sustainability, water management, air quality, and public health. So we're going to start first with early civilization, which is the rise of humankind to ancient Rome. So on the earliest times, related to solid waste management, there was basically no need to do that before when they were nomads, right? When they started developing communities, leaving waste from food and fuel outside the home will invite vectors to thrive and breed among the urban developments. So that's why they needed to start thinking about the way that they were managing solid waste. But at that stage, there were not so many people in communities, so they could just leave this waste far, or they were starting doing other practices such as burning. Now, let's think about public health. This is like the realization of the actions that they're taking, how these affect the community, right? And they were basically careless on those times, but something that was important is about deforestation, because they were realizing that deforestation could lead to several problems for the communities. In respect to water management, there is evidence that the Romans were building dams, and that means that they were trying to storage drinking water, and this is connected to the rise of the agriculture practices. Now let's move to the Middle Ages. Middle Ages, they give the rise to such great things such as algebra, and the creation of the clock and the Magna Carta, right? When we talk about solid waste management in those times, we can talk now about heavy influx of people into cities, and this posed a tremendous waste problem. And this is when we start looking at pandemics. For instance, the Black Death destroyed from 30 to 60% of the European population during that time. And it was the start of rethinking what practices should be permitted for the sake of public occupational health, right? In respect to water management, we can talk about the use of wells, and then the situation where they started being contaminated for overuse and overpopulation. And much of this contamination was coming from human excreta, which were not disposed in a sanitary fashion. So sewage was covered in the streets of Europe. You can imagine that this was not the best time to live in Europe, because there was bad odor everywhere, and it was not a good environment. Then, in respect to air quality, the problem was mainly burning wood, coal, and garbage, because this was a common practice, and this is also the result of the industrialization, right? So, England was, for instance, becoming highly industrialized, and there were wood shortages, and so they started relying on sea coal. But sea coal is high in sulfur, and sulfur produces pollutants like such as sulfur dioxide, and also it does not allow complete oxidation or complete burning of this material, so it also leads to carbon monoxide and particulate matter. When in this time, public health become more important. So there were still not modern solid waste management practices, but they started to have some kind of legislation, and they started so the legislation actually was focused on human health. Let's move now to the age of enlightenment, which is from 1650 to 1800. This age led to scientific and philosophical and humanitarian developments. Um, and in respect to environmental issues, during this period, populations within urban environments continue to grow, but also illness and diseases, despite the regulations and the development that they were having now. In respect to sustainability, it was a moment where there was a realization about things like conservation, right? Where they were realizing that it was important to switch from wood to coal in an attempt to save forests. In respect to water management, filtration became a more viable treatment technique. So this was like the early stages of treatment, of water treatment. They were using sand filters, and they were using materials to get the water more, a little bit cleaner. And they were started to use municipal sewers. This was on the 1800s. In respect to the air quality, this was still a permanent problem. The smoke affected the comfort, health, and peace and harmony of all the cities, and this continued being a problem because of the use of fuel materials. Let's continue with the Industrial Revolution. This is a time where there was, of course, significant growth of population, and also growth of activities, right? That led to pollution of air and also water and different solid waste. And this was actually, interestingly, this was a time where there was a prediction from Arrhenius about global warming from fossil fuel induced carbon dioxide. And in 1880, a temperature inversion led to an air pollution episode in London that killed 700 people. In respect to sustainability, people started having concern about the resource consumption during the Industrial Revolution. So they were realizing that there was a lot of destruction of the environmental systems, and that this was going to be a problem in the future. In respect to water management, sanitation and water supply systems were developed, and drinking water became important in fighting typhoid and cholera. And this is the time also when Louis Pasteur, about the theory about how diseases are spread, was released. Let's move on now to the Progressive Era. The Progressive Era marked the beginning of the period known as the Machine Age. During this time, we have, in respect to sustainability, the realization of conservation, that conservation was important. And this was a period where, for instance, in the USA, wild buffalo populations that are known as bisons dropped from 30 million to less than 40 animals in less than a century. So unfortunately, this was not the only species in danger, but there was no realization of how important was or how significant the problem was. This was the time also when the acts or conservation efforts started being developed. In respect to water management, this was the time the initiation of the biological treatments. So this was the time for that the drinking filter was developed, and that they started treating water. In respect to air quality, this was the episode that killed over 1,000 London citizens due to the smoke-related issues. And this was during winter of 1909 because there was an inversion of and this caused the trapment of these pollutants in the air. And then also this was the time when lead poison was a problem, and this was linked to the use of paints, right? And they started realizing that they had to that the lead in the paint were killing children. Let's move on now to the Great Depression and the World War II. This was a time where the environmental efforts were put aside because there were more important things. But don't forget that this was the time where the atomic bombs were dropped in Japanese cities. And this is something, a major environmental issue, right? But there were also some other issues still going on. In respect to the air quality, there was also realization of the greenhouse gas effect because they were seeing that they were noticing that again during winter periods there were episodes of air pollution that could kill people. And then also it was the realization that the lead in gasoline was a human concern, was a problem. Let's move on now to the post-war area and also to the present times. After a relatively quick transition between the tension of war and a time of peace, the years after the World War II provided a growth in economy, resulting in a more affluent lifestyle of many people. So these comforts are the ones that we are already enjoying, like vacuum cleaners, televisions, etc. Right? So there was a time of many benefits from the technology. But in respect to environmental issues, there were still a lot of things going on because there was no realization that some pollutants were affecting the environment. This was the case, for instance, of fluorochlorocarbons, right? And things that were being used normally in equipments that were a threat. This was also the time where there was a great emphasis on conservation of natural resources. And this was the time when the book Silent Spring and The Silent War by Charles Carson and Jacques Cousteau, respectively, encouraged greater concern for the environment. The Silent Spring is an environmental science book that talks about the environmental effects caused by the use of pesticides. And Carson, the author of the book, accused the chemical industry of spreading disinformation and and also not saying the whole truth about the potential effects of the use of pesticides. During this time, also, we started having the realization of whale conservation, and also was the time where mining was prohibited in the Antarctic. So, as I mentioned to you, air quality, the realization of the pollutants such as chlorofluorocarbons, nitrogen oxides occurred during this time. And also the connection between, for instance, these pollutants and the depletion of the ozone layer in the stratosphere. This was also the time, it's more recent times, like we're talking about 1987, where the Montreal Protocol was approved by 24 countries. So we start having agreements. Later on in 1997, the Kyoto Protocol was adopted also by many nations in an effort to reduce carbon dioxide emissions. So from the post-war era to the present times, there were a lot of events that were already recorded in the environmental history. You can visit this website where a lot of information is given about different disasters all over the world, including the Chernobyl disaster, the Gulf War oil disaster, etc. So what can we learn about these environmental issues? And to analyze this, let's talk about proactive versus reactive approach. In many of the cases that we have seen, there has been a reactive approach, which is based on responding to events after they have happened. And we need, as engineers, to facilitate moving to a more proactive approach. So in general, environmental regulations really started from concerns from group of citizens, business, or government agencies that came to the realization of a problem, and they wanted that the government to take actions, right? So this is how the process, this is a general overview from about how the process of policies and regulations take place. Then this is an example from the model that the USA has. So there is an issue raised by the society, and then the Congress passes environmental bill and the president signs it, and then there is they create the EPA creates a draft for the regulation, and then they receive public comment, and then there is a final regulation published in Federal Register. In this figure, we show all the environmental regulations, key environmental regulations that have passed till the recent times, and a lot of things, and also some of the key events that have happened. I'm not going to get into detail of these events because of the time constraints and because probably you have heard of some of them. So what I want from you is to come to the realization why it's important to know the history of the environmental issues. Example of regulations passed by the Queensland environmental legislation that an engineer will encounter during a typical civil engineering development project are the following ones. And these are growing with increasing environmental awareness, and because people are moving, or the community is moving more to a sustainable society. So think about all these regulations and how you can be confronted to these ones during your engineering profession. So we have talked about environmental issues till present day, and now let's move on to the future. We want to talk about climate change, sustainability, circular economy, and probably post-COVID era. So what was different from the past? There were localized environmental issues that were registered and that were a concern in a local community, in local communities, in cities. But for the first time in our history now, due to a large part to the size of its population, now humans have the capacity to significantly alter the Earth's biosphere. We can think still about big examples, for instance, like the Chernobyl disaster or the atomic bomb, that have left legacies that are still affecting us. But we're going to talk about effects that have been growing slowly, but continuously, and that humans will have to face. And this is the challenge for for engineers, and from an environmental perspective.